Chapter 3. Calvin awoke to the pale morning light pressing through the cracks in the cabin walls, tracing thin golden lines across the rough wooden floor. His blanket, little more than a frayed patchwork of old fabric, was tangled around his legs. He groaned, rubbing his face with the back of his hand, as if he could wipe away the lingering weight of sleep. He didn't want to get up yet, not after yesterday. For a brief moment, he considered burrowing back under the covers, but the sharp clang of a cast-iron pan downstairs shattered that thought. Abram was already awake. Calvin sighed, rolling onto his side. He could still hear the argument in his head, Abram's measured tone against his own frustration. It was just a rat. But that hadn't been the point. Not to Abram. The old man never let anything slide, and Calvin had learned over the years that his patience wasn't infinite. The smell of biscuits, burnt ones by the scent of it, drifted up from the kitchen. Calvin hesitated at the top of the stairs, listening. No heavy footsteps, no loud sighs, just the steady shuffle of Abram moving through his morning routine. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't still mad. The old wooden stairs creaked under his weight as he made his way down. The kitchen, like every other part inside of the cabin, was a place of deliberate order. Everything had a place, and in its place it stayed. Abram was standing at the stove, his broad back to Calvin, flipping eggs in a pan that was long past its prime. The heavy beams above them cast long shadows, giving the small space a feeling of solidity, of age. Without turning around, Abram slid 2 eggs and a couple of biscuits onto a plate and pushed it across the table. "Better eat it all," he said. "We've got a long drive today." His voice was even. No mention of yesterday. Calvin hesitated, then pulled out a chair. The biscuits were dense enough to double as bludgeons, and the eggs were edged in dark brown. A typical Abram breakfast. He prodded at them with his fork, waiting for Abram to fill the silence. Nothing. After a long moment, Calvin cleared his throat. "Where are we going?" Abram leaned against the counter, arms crossed. His rolled-up sleeves revealed strong forearms dusted with fine grey hairs, the kind of arms built from years of labor rather than gym training. His sharp blue eyes flicked to Calvin, studying him for a beat before answering. "The Tuckett farm," he said. "You'll stay with them until school starts." Calvin frowned, mid-bite. "That's nearly a month early. Something's come up. Something important." Abram's grip tightened. He turned back to the sink, scrubbing the skillet with slow, deliberate movements. Calvin chewed a piece of biscuit, his teeth clinched along with the tension in the air. Abram wasn't lying, but he wasn't telling the whole truth either. He never sent Calvin away early, unless he had a good reason. "I need you to prep the truck after breakfast," Abram continued. "Check the tires. Load up the blacktail." Calvin's stomach dropped. "What?" "The bike's going with us." Abram didn't look up. Calvin's fork slipped from his fingers, clattering against the plate with a sharp clang that cut through the silence. His chest went tight. The blacktail. He barely heard the next words Abram said. They blurred into the background, drowned out by the low hum of frustration building inside him. The bike wasn't just a pile of parts. It was proof that he could make something work, that he could build something that was his, that he could be more than a screw-up Abram had to keep in line. He forced his voice to stay even. "You're getting rid of it." Abram didn't even glance up. "I think it's time we cleared out some dangerous distractions," he said simply. A distraction. That's all it was to him. Not the hours Calvin had spent, not the late nights sorting through rusted parts, not the way he had almost gotten the thing to start. His hands clenched into fists beneath the table. It wasn't fair, but arguing wouldn't change a damn thing. He wasn't talking about just the bike, the rat, the BB gun. The way Calvin never seemed to hesitate when it came to reckless decisions. The blacktail was supposed to be harmless. Just a project, just something to tinker with. But Abrams saw what it could become. He always did. It didn't matter that it didn't run yet. It mattered that one day it would. Calvin clenched his jaw. It was punishment, just not the kind you could argue with. He shoved a forkful of crunchy egg into his mouth, chewing hard to keep from saying something he'd regret. The meal passed in silence, except for the occasional scrape of a chair or clink of metal on ceramic. When his plate was finally clean, more out of habit than appetite, he pushed back his chair. "May I be excused?" Abram nodded. "Get moving." Calvin was already halfway to the door when Abram spoke again. "And Calvin," he stopped, hand hovering over the door frame. Abram didn't turn as he spoke, his voice low but edged with something firm, something final. "No more hunting things that don't deserve it, Calvin." It wasn't a warning. It wasn't an argument. It was a decision, and one Calvin already knew he wouldn't be able to undo. He forced himself to nod. "Yes, sir," Calvin muttered, shoving the cabin door open and stepped outside, squinting as the morning light hit his face. The air was crisp, sharp with the scent, damp earth, the last remnants of last night's rain still clinging to the grass. His boots sank slightly into the mud, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, on the blacktail, on Abram, on everything being taken out of his hands. He wasn't stupid. He knew why Abram was doing this. It didn't mean he had to like it. The barn loomed ahead, its rusted tin roof sagging slightly, where time and the elements had taken their toll. The doors groaned in protest as he shoved them open, the hinges stiff from disuse. Inside, the smell of oil, dry hay, and metal filled the air, mingling with the faint tang of long, empty gas tanks from machines that hadn't run in decades. His eyes immediately landed on the blacktail, half buried under a tattered canvas tarp in the corner. He let out a breath and walked past it without stopping. If he let himself look too long, he might actually start trying to fix it again. Instead, he headed for the truck. It sat near the center of the barn, coated in a layer of dust, but still commanding the space like a machine built for something more than just dirt roads. The frame was reinforced, built for impact, with a raised suspension that gave it a brutal, almost predatory stance. Wide, knobby tires jutted out beneath heavy-duty fenders, built for clawing through mud, rock, and whatever else the wilderness threw at it. There was no traditional drivetrain. Instead, each massive wheel housed its own electric motor, embedded directly inside the hub. Thick, worn, high-voltage cables ran along the suspension arms, connecting back to a reinforced battery unit tucked beneath the truck bed. Unlike the city cars that fed off Prax's power grid, this thing ran on its own, an independent system designed for long distances and rough terrain. He unlatched the truck bed and climbed up, throwing his duffel bag down with more force than necessary. Packing was simple. He didn't have much to bring. A couple of shirts, an extra jacket, some old work gloves. The only real luxuries were a few battered electronic devices. Things that had been useless for months out here, but would turn on the moment he entered Praxis. His frosted glass tablet, a phone that had seen too many years, and an old holodisplay unit that still had a few old training sims loaded onto it. At the last second, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the small gemstone key for the blacktail. It was dull now, lifeless without a power source, but he curled his fingers around it before shoving it deep into his pack. It was useless, sure, but it was still his. He yanked the rope, securing the blacktail to its spot in the truck bed, tightening the knots out of habit. It didn't even run, but somehow, seeing it there still felt like an insult. He dropped down from the truck and popped the hood, not to check the engine, since there wasn't one, but out of pure instinct. He moved quickly, poking around the various parts he knew needed attention before a long trip. The battery was bioelectric, stable but hungry, something uncommon even for Praxis. An invention, a lost discovery. Who knew where Abram had found it? Its sugary food glowing faintly green through the reinforced tubing. He ran his hand over the thick power conduits snaking from the battery to the wheels, making sure none of the connections were loose. The suspension arms looked solid, their hydraulic joints still stiff but functional. Finally, he walked around the truck and pressed his boot against the front left tire, watching the suspension settle slightly. The tires were still holding pressure, and the deep tread was more than enough for anything the roads could throw at them. Satisfied, he shut the hood with a solid thud and stepped back, wiping his hands on his jeans. Behind him, Abram's footsteps crunched on the dirt floor. Calvin didn't turn. "It's ready." Abram didn't answer at first, just walked to the truck and ran his hand along the edge of the blacktail's seat. "I know you think I'm doing this just to take it from you," he said finally. "Someday you will be on your own. You will understand. This thing will carry you where you want. It's too soon to leave this temptation lingering in front of you, Calvin." Calvin forced himself not to look at him. "I've been working on it for months," he muttered, his voice tight. "I know." Abram let out a long breath. "That's the problem." Calvin's fingers curled into a fist at his side. Of course that was the problem. Everything he got interested in, everything that made him feel like he was working towards something, Abram saw as another risk, another mistake waiting to happen. "Get in," Abram said, stepping toward the driver's side. "We've got a long way to go." Calvin didn't move at first, just stood there. Then, without a word, he climbed into the passenger seat and slammed the door shut behind him. The truck hummed to life, the soft green glow of the battery casting faint light across the dashboard. Without another word, Abram threw it into drive, and they pulled away from the cabin. The truck rumbled steadily over the uneven dirt road, the hum of the wheel motors shifting as the terrain changed beneath them. The old highway had been buried under a century of neglect, its remains barely visible beneath the creeping grasp of nature. Grass and twisted roots poked through cracked asphalt, turning what had once been a smooth drive into something closer to an off-road trek. Calvin stared out the window, arms crossed. Miles of empty land stretched on, broken only by distant tree lines and the occasional remains of old road signs. Neither of them had spoken much since they left. Abram wasn't much for talking when he drove. Calvin wasn't much for talking at all today. He knew where they were headed, to the Tuckett farm, where he'd spend the next month before school started. What he didn't know was why Abram had suddenly decided to bring it up this morning. The man planned things in his head for weeks before ever saying anything, and now, out of nowhere, he was being sent away early. Not that he minded much. The Tucketts had always been good to him, tolerant at the very least. Still, something about it felt off. Abram had seemed almost distracted, and that wasn't like him. Calvin let his thoughts drift, watching the scenery blur past in shades of green and brown. They had a long way to go before hitting the valley. The Tuckett farm was still hours away, and Praxis was weeks, which meant he had time to figure out what Abram wasn't telling him. It was the only reason he hadn't pushed harder for an answer, because Abram always had a reason, and if he waited long enough, he'd figure it out himself. After more than an hour of silence, out of the corner of his eye, movement. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow slipping through the trees, gone too fast to be certain. But then he saw it again, a figure, keeping just beyond the ridge. Calvin straightened slightly, his eyes narrowed, too big to be a deer, too fast to be anything else. Then the sun caught it just right, and he saw it, the streak of red fur weaving between the trunks, his body feeling a rush of contempt. Crimson, a Canavari, the second one he'd ever seen. The first had been locked in a cage, chained, controlled. This one was free. His pulse quickened. The black markings across its body snaked like intricate tattoos, twisting over its shoulders and ribs in delicate but jagged patterns. He had heard about them before, how each Canavari bore unique markings, like fingerprints. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was what they were. The Canavari weren't just animals. They were the monsters that abandoned Praxis. Traitors, killers, and now one was following them. His fingers curled into fists, nails biting into his palms. He kept his voice flat, but inside, something bristled like a live wire. "I don't suppose this early trip has anything to do with that Canavari shadowing us." Abram didn't react right away. He kept his hands steady on the wheel, his expression unreadable. But Calvin noticed the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his grip on the steering wheel tightened just enough to betray him. A pause. Then a quiet breath. Some of it, not all of it. Calvin's jaw locked. It didn't come alone, did it? Another pause. Another fraction of a second where Abram didn't meet his eyes. No. The word was barely above a whisper, but it landed like a stone in Calvin's gut. Calvin stared at him, waiting for more. When it didn't come, his frustration boiled over. Why help them? His voice was sharper than he intended, but he didn't care. They abandoned Praxis. They could have just left, but they killed people. People they could have let live. Abram's grip on the wheel didn't change, but there was something different in his expression now. Something distant. Everyone knew the story. The Canavari had been created as weapons, guardians of Praxis, designed to protect its people, to kill a fury if they ever found one. But they turned their backs on that duty. One night, they left, slipping into the darkness beyond the walls, tearing through everything and everyone in their path. It was the night Calvin had lost everything. He tried to conjure memories that evaded him. He was too young. He had to imagine it. The blood, the fire, the screaming. But knew one thing with absolute certainty. That was the night Abram found him. And now, here he was, helping them. Calvin's stomach churned with something cold. He hated the Canavari, more than the Patrioti, more than the Dredge, more than anything. They chose freedom, Calvin, Abram said quietly. Something not many are brave enough to do. Calvin's breath came out in a short laugh. Bitter. Brave. His knuckles turned white where his hands clenched his arms. They're cowards. They're murderers. He turned back toward the window, watching as the Canavari paused on a rocky outcrop, its head turned toward the truck. It knew they had seen it, but it didn't run, didn't hide, just stared, watching. Calvin's throat tightened as old anger swirled inside him, deep and unwavering. Whatever Abram's reasons were, he would never share them. To Calvin, the Canavari would always be the same. Traitors. Killers. And if this one had come looking for Abram, it meant nothing but trouble. The truck bounced over a stretch of uneven ground, and Calvin pulled his gaze away from the Canavari. He expected Abram to shift the conversation back to the Tuckett farm. Instead, he said something that completely derailed Calvin's train of thought. You won't be staying with the Tucketts at school this year. The words landed like a slap, sharp and unexpected. Calvin blinked. What? Abram didn't look at him. You'll be staying with the Truesdales. Calvin felt his stomach drop. For a second, he thought he'd misheard, because there was no way. The Truesdales weren't just some farm family. They were patrioti, the kind of people who saw kids like him as disposable. His thoughts tripped over themselves, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe Abram meant something else. Why? Abram's hands stayed steady on the wheel. I made arrangements. You'll be staying with Daxton and Julia Truesdale for the school term. Calvin exhaled sharply, shaking his head. This about the accident from last year? He questioned. If it was, Abram didn't say. He just kept driving. And that was somehow worse than getting an answer. If Abram wanted someone keeping an eye on him, this would be the way to do it. Things have changed, Abram said simply. This is what's best. Calvin frowned, but didn't argue. Not because he agreed, but because, in some strange way, he could make sense of it. Abram had never been just some old man living in the woods. He had connections, ties to the Patrioti that no one ever really questioned. He didn't always explain himself, but his decisions, no matter how frustrating, were never without purpose. Calvin settled back into his seat. He wasn't sure how he felt about the whole thing, but curiosity, that was enough to keep him from protesting. For now, the truck rumbled down the last stretch of broken road, its motors adjusting to the terrain with a low, steady hum. Calvin had stopped talking by this point, letting the weight of everything settle in his head. The Canavari, the Truesdales. His mind swirled with questions, but he kept them to himself. Instead, he watched the world pass by, outside the window. The mountains had shrunk behind them, fading into the horizon, replaced by rolling fields of golden grass and narrow strips of farmland. Icane sat tucked into the valley, A town built fast and built cheap, a patchwork of necessity, slapped together in the rush to feed Praxis. It wasn't old, not like the cities. 4 or 5 decades ago, this land had been barren, empty, forgotten. Praxis needed food. Now, a dense cluster of buildings made up the town's core, houses packed close for safety, forming a thin but vital lifeline between the great city and the land that sustained it. The buildings were simple, made from prefab panels, scrap metal, and salvaged concrete, thrown together with little thought beyond function. Some had solar panels clinging to their rooftops. Others had reinforced shutters and welded doors, a reminder that wild things still roamed beyond the farms. Even out here, technology hadn't disappeared entirely. A few maintenance drones hovered above rooftops, scanning for damage. A water purification station hummed softly near the town's center, fed by a small canal that ran alongside the main road. People moved through the crowded central market, where traders and farmers bartered for supplies: bushels of grain, crates of produce, rationed fuel cells for irrigation equipment. A small group of guards from Praxis sent to shoot any predators that came too close. This town didn't exist for itself. It existed to serve Praxis. It was a reminder that while the city could pretend to be self-sufficient, it had spent centuries poisoning its own land. Without places like this, it would starve. The truck rumbled past long, low storage facilities, where grains and produce were stacked into crates stamped with the Praxis insignia. Everything grown here was claimed before it even left the soil. Then the town fell behind them, and the open land stretched out again. One last road, one last home, the Tuckett farm. The sign came into view before the house did. A simple plank of wood, painted green, the words, "Welcome to the Tucketts," scrawled in thick white lettering. It swung gently on an iron post, the paint slightly faded, but still carefully maintained. The driveway stretched ahead, long and winding, flanked on either side by rows of fruit trees and fields of corn. The smell of fresh soil and ripening crops filled the air, replacing the dust and dry scent of the open road. Then, finally, the house. Unlike the town, it wasn't built in a hurry. It wasn't slapped together from whatever materials were on hand. It was built right. A 2-story farmhouse, white with a copper roof gleaming under the sun. The porch wrapped wide around the front, its beams thick, every board carefully laid, every nail driven with precision. Poor Tuckett had built it with his own hands, long before his children were born. Not because he had to, but because, in his words, if something's worth doing, it's worth doing right. Calvin had heard that phrase 1,000 times. Poor Tuckett didn't believe in half measures. It was the exact opposite of Abram's way of thinking. Abram, who would patch a hole in the roof with whatever he had nearby, who had taught Calvin to make do with what was available, rather than waste time chasing perfection. But here, every joint was seamless, every plank carefully treated. Because Paul believed a home wasn't just shelter. It was proof of the work that went into it. Abram slowed the truck to a stop. Calvin barely had time to shove open the door before the first familiar voice rang out. "Calvin, you're back? I would have guessed you'd stay in hiding a little longer." A lanky boy with sun-bleached hair and wire-rimmed glasses stood near the porch, a smirk tugging at his face. Winstead, the one person in this world Calvin called a friend. A second later, the farmhouse door swung open, and Mrs. Tuckett stepped onto the porch, drying her hands on her apron. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," she said, her voice warm, but sharp enough to remind him she hadn't forgotten last summer's incidents. Calvin tried to keep a straight face, but she wasn't having it. "Don't just stand there. Come here and give me a hug, you filthy thing." Calvin hesitated just long enough for her to yank him forward and wrap her arms around him in a firm, motherly squeeze. It was comforting, more than he wanted to admit. But at the same time, awkward. He wasn't a kid anymore. Even then, hugs made him uncomfortable. Mrs. Tuckett had plenty of sons. He wasn't one of them, but sometimes it felt like he could have been. He cleared his throat, shifting in her grasp. Yeah, okay, Miss Tuckett." She pulled back, eyeing him up and down, making some silent assessment. Finally, she gave a short nod, patting his shoulder. You're too skinny. We'll fix that. Before he could respond, movement near the barn caught his attention. Brooklyn. She stood near the barn, arms crossed, watching him the way someone watches a storm on the horizon, expecting something, waiting for it. Her hair was longer than he remembered, dark mahogany falling in loose waves, but her face hadn't changed, still freckled, still bright. But her eyes searched his face, as if looking for something he wasn't sure he had. She smiled, but there was a hesitation in it, like she wasn't sure what he'd say. Hey, Calvin. His throat felt dry. He shifted his weight, glancing past her instead of at her. Oh, hey, Brooke. He caught the way her smile twitched slightly wider, like she knew he was doing it on purpose, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. She had always followed him around since they were kids, always tried to hold his hand when they walked, always found an excuse to be near him. It wasn't that he disliked her, he liked having her around a little too much. It was just that he didn't know what to do with her, and she knew it. Mrs. Tuckett pulled back, patting his cheek. Go on now, get your things inside. Calvin nodded, turning toward the truck. The moment he moved, Winstead fell into step beside him, already grinning like an idiot. Still playing dumb, huh? He said under his breath. Calvin shot him a look. Shut up. Brooklyn was still standing there when he glanced back, still watching, still smiling. Calvin yanked his bag from the truck, throwing it over his shoulder with a little more force than necessary. It was going to be a long summer.